Marcus Whitfield pushed open the kitchen door and froze. Dolores was feeding his 5-month-old son William pureed sweet potato. "What the hell is this?" He snatched the bowl, hurling it against the wall. "You're feeding my son slave food," William wailed. Dolores stood still, spoon trembling. "Sir, he wouldn't take his formula. You people always have excuses." He pointed to the door. "Get out. Now!" William screamed, reaching for Dolores. "Out." Marcus blocked her path to the baby. Dolores walked out with quiet dignity. The morning had started with unusual tension in the Whitfield penthouse, a $30 million triplex overlooking Central Park that felt more like a corporate showcase than a home where a baby should grow up. Marcus Whitfield, 42 years old and worth $3 billion, had built his technology empire on the premise that disruption required ruthlessness, that sentiment was weakness, that every human interaction could be reduced to a transaction. His company, Whitfield Technologies, had revolutionized data mining and predictive analytics, making him one of the youngest billionaires in America, celebrated on magazine covers as the future of American innovation. But success had come at a price that went beyond the long hours and sacrificed relationships it had cost him his humanity, though he wouldn't realize this until it was almost too late. His marriage to Catherine had been transactional from the start, a merger between his tech money and her family's old Manhattan real estate fortune. Their wedding had been featured in Vogue, 500 guests at the plaza. A celebration of wealth joining wealth. But behind the perfect photos was a cold reality. Marcus had seen Catherine as an acquisition, a beautiful accessory, who would provide him with an heir and the social connections he needed to move beyond new money into established power. Her death 3 months after William's birth from a pulmonary embolism had been an inconvenience to his schedule, a disruption to his carefully planned life. He'd given himself exactly 1 day to grieve, then returned to work, leaving his infant son in the care of the help. Dolores Washington was 25 years old, though her bearing suggested someone who'd lived multiple lifetimes of struggle and triumph. She possessed the kind of beauty that made people uncomfortable, not because it was ostentatious, but because it was undeniable, impossible to ignore or diminish. Her dark skin glowed with health despite the exhaustion of working 18-hour days. Her figure was naturally curved in ways that expensive surgeries tried and failed to replicate. Her body, speaking of ancestral strength that no amount of privilege could purchase. Her hair, worn in intricate braids, that she did herself every Sunday night after putting William to bed, crowned a face that belonged on magazine covers, but was instead bent over dirty diapers and midnight feedings. But her beauty was secondary to her brilliance, a fact that Marcus Whitfield would never have believed even if someone had told him directly. She graduated from Columbia Medical School just 6 months earlier, first in her class, with professors calling her the most promising student they'd seen in a decade. Her thesis on detecting cardiac abnormalities in infants had won national awards. She'd been courted by the best hospitals in the country, offered positions that would have fast-tracked her to department head within a decade. Her residency at Mount Sinai was supposed to start in September, a position in pediatric cardiology that only 2 students per year were selected for. But life had intervened with the kind of cruelty that seemed reserved for those who worked hardest to escape poverty. Her mother, Patricia Washington, had been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer the week of Dolores's medical school graduation. The timing had been almost poetic in its cruelty, the culmination of years of sacrifice destroyed by malignant cells that didn't care about dreams or dedication. Patricia had worked 3 jobs to put Dolores through undergrad at Howard, cleaning offices at night, working as a home health aide during the day, and doing laundry on weekends. She'd sold her car to help with medical school applications, taking 3 buses to work in the snow. She'd lived on rice and beans so her daughter could afford study materials. Had developed arthritis from years of scrubbing floors, but never complained. Had poured every ounce of her strength into ensuring Dolores could escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped their family for generations. Now, the cancer treatment would cost more than Dolores could hope to earn as a resident. The oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering had been blunt with the casual cruelty of someone who delivered death sentences daily, without aggressive treatment. Patricia had perhaps 6 months. With treatment, maybe 2 years. Though the quality of life would be questionable. The treatment would cost $300,000 minimum. And that was just to start. Insurance would cover some of it, But the experimental drugs that offered the best hope weren't covered at all. The oncologist had suggested clinical trials, charity programs, payment plans, all the things he suggested to poor people who couldn't afford to live. Dolores had deferred her residency, a decision that had shocked her professors and classmates, who couldn't understand why anyone would throw away such an opportunity. Dr. Martinez, her mentor who'd guided her through 4 years of medical school, had actually cried when she told him. "You're throwing away your career," he'd said, his voice breaking with frustration. "Take out loans. Find another way. Don't let the system win." But Dolores knew the reality of medical training, that her well-meaning mentor didn't. Residents worked 80-hour weeks for barely minimum wage, had no flexibility for family care, and certainly couldn't earn enough to pay for experimental cancer treatments. The math was simple and cruel. She could become a doctor and watch her mother die, or she could postpone her dreams and maybe save the woman who'd sacrificed everything for her. She'd taken the nanny job through an exclusive agency that catered to Manhattan's ultra-wealthy, the kind of people who paid more for childcare than most Americans earned in a year. The owner, Mrs. Pemberton, had been impressed by Dolores's credentials, not her medical degree, which she'd hidden, but her degree in child development from Howard, that she'd completed as part of a dual degree program. "You're overqualified," Mrs. Pemberton had said, studying Dolores's resume with suspicious eyes. "Why would someone with your education want to be a nanny?" Dolores had crafted a story about wanting to work with children before starting her graduate studies, letting the white woman assume she meant education or social work, not medicine. The agency had presented her to the Whitfields as a highly educated caregiver, without mentioning that she was actually Dr. Washington, that her knowledge of infant development came from pediatric rotations where she'd saved dozens of babies, not from textbooks about child psychology. Catherine Whitfield had hired her immediately, perhaps sensing something deeper than what appeared on paper. During the interview, conducted in the same kitchen where Dolores would later be humiliated, Catherine had studied her with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "I need someone special for William," she'd said, her hand resting on her still-swollen belly, the C-section scar hidden beneath designer clothes. "Someone who will see him, really see him, not just as Marcus's son but as his own person." "Can you do that?" Dolores had recognized something in Catherine's eyes. Fear, maybe, or premonition. The kind of look she'd seen in mothers who somehow knew they wouldn't be there to raise their children. "I'll protect him," Dolores had said, meaning it more deeply than Catherine could have known. "I'll keep him safe." Catherine had hired her on the spot, offering $8,000 a month, enough to cover Patricia's treatments with some left over for the rent on their tiny apartment in Queens. It was supposed to be simple care for a baby during the day, study medical journals at night, save her mother, then return to her real life. She hadn't counted on falling in love with William, or on discovering that he needed her medical expertise as much as her care. Catherine's death had changed everything in the Whitfield household. The blood clot that traveled to her lungs had been swift and merciless, taking her during what should have been a routine afternoon at the spa. She'd been getting a massage, the autopsy later revealed, when the embolism struck. She'd had just enough time to gasp her son's name before dying. Her last thought for the baby she'd barely had time to know. She'd left behind a 3-month-old son who would never remember her face, a husband who'd barely noticed she was gone except for the inconvenience to his schedule, and a secret that would only emerge months later, when everything else had fallen apart. In her final weeks, Catherine had discovered something about William that the pediatricians had missed, something her mother's intuition had detected but couldn't name. She'd watched him struggle to breathe during feeding, noticed the blue tinge around his lips during crying spells, felt the irregular flutter of his heart during cuddles. She'd insisted on more tests, had taken him to 3 different pediatricians, had even gone to the emergency room once when his breathing seemed particularly labored. But Marcus had dismissed her concerns as postpartum anxiety, had actually yelled at her for making him look like a hypochondriac parent to their rich friends. "The best pediatricians in Manhattan have examined him," he'd said during their last argument, 2 days before she died. "Stop creating problems where none exist. You're embarrassing me." But Catherine had been right to worry. Had been right about everything, actually. Dolores had recognized the signs immediately, the subtle symptoms of long QT syndrome, a genetic heart condition that could cause sudden infant death if left untreated. She'd seen it during her pediatric cardiology rotation, had written a paper on misdiagnoses in infants that had been published in a medical journal under her professor's name. She'd learned to spot what others overlooked, the tiny signs that meant the difference between life and death. William's particular variant was especially dangerous, triggered by stress, temperature changes, and certain foods. Without proper management, he could suffer cardiac arrest at any moment. The European formula, Marcus insisted on $40 a can, imported from Switzerland, was actually dangerous for William. Its high sodium content could trigger arrhythmias, could stop his tiny heart without warning. The sweet potato puree Dolores prepared was carefully calibrated for optimal potassium levels, temperature controlled to prevent reflux, portioned to avoid overwhelming his delicate system. She'd researched for hours to find the perfect balance, had tested different preparations until she found what worked. Every morning, she'd wake at 4 to prepare his food for the day, measuring ingredients with the precision of a pharmacist, monitoring temperature with the dedication of a chef preparing a meal for critics. It wasn't just food, it was medicine, carefully disguised as simple baby food to avoid raising Marcus's suspicions. She'd tried once to tell Marcus about her concerns, shortly after Catherine's death, when his grief might have made him receptive to hearing difficult truths. She'd waited until he'd had his second scotch, when his defenses were lower, when he might actually listen. "Mr. Whitfield," she'd said carefully, choosing her words with the precision she'd learned during patient consultations. "I've noticed some irregularities in William's breathing patterns. Perhaps we should have him examined by a specialist." I could recommend his response had been swift and dismissive, cutting her off mid-sentence. "You're a nanny, not a doctor. Stick to changing diapers, and leave the medical opinions to people with actual degrees." The irony had burned like acid in her throat. But Dolores had swallowed it along with all the other indignities, using the service entrance, even in thunderstorms, eating in the kitchen, standing up because sitting was too familiar, being referred to as the girl when Marcus spoke about her to others, as if her name was too difficult to remember. The penthouse itself was a testament to Marcus's need to display wealth rather than enjoy it. 20,000 square feet of marble and glass, decorated by someone who charged $500,000 to create spaces that photographed well for Architectural Digest, but felt cold and hostile to actual humans. The nursery was particularly absurd, a 10,000 square foot room decorated in shades of gray and white that might have been appropriate for a corporate boardroom, but seemed almost aggressive for an infant. The designer had insisted it was modern minimalism, but Dolores saw it for what it was: a space designed to impress adults who would never spend time there, not comfort a baby who had to live in it. William cried constantly in that room, overwhelmed by the echo and emptiness, his wails bouncing off cold walls that offered no comfort. The expensive crib, custom made in Italy, was too large for his tiny body, making him feel lost and vulnerable. The temperature was kept at precisely 68 degrees, because that's what the designer had recommended, but William needed warmth, needed to feel held even when he wasn't being carried. So Dolores had created a small corner near the kitchen, where she'd placed a simple rocking chair she'd bought with her own money at a second-hand store in Queens. She'd hung colorful fabric her grandmother had sewn decades ago, pieces that had comforted her own mother as a baby. She played soft jazz from her phone, Nina Simone and Billie Holiday singing lullabies that had soothed generations of black babies through harder nights than this. This was where William thrived, where he smiled his first smile at 2 months old, where he felt safe enough to sleep deeply instead of the fitful dozing he managed in his designer nursery. Marcus never came to this corner, never saw how his son's face lit up when Dolores sang the gospel hymns her mother had taught her, the same songs Patricia now hummed through chemotherapy treatments. He never saw Dolores checking William's pulse with practiced fingers while pretending to play pat a cake, never noticed her tracking his breathing patterns while seeming to simply rock him to sleep, never realized that the woman he paid to change diapers was actually performing complex medical monitoring every moment she was with his son. The morning of the incident, Marcus had been particularly agitated, his usual controlled demeanor cracking under pressure from multiple directions. A deal with Chinese investors had fallen through at the last minute, costing the company $200 million and making him look weak to his board. The Wall Street Journal was preparing an expose on Whitfield Technologies' discriminatory hiring practices. Not a single black executive in a company of 3,000 employees, despite having a diversity statement that claimed commitment to inclusion. 3 female engineers had filed a joint lawsuit alleging sexual harassment and pay discrimination. Their lawyer, the same woman who'd taken down Uber's toxic culture. Marcus needed to project control, stability. The image of a devoted single father raising his son with the best of everything money could buy. Finding Dolores, feeding William homemade food, instead of the expensive formula, had triggered all his insecurities about image, control, and superiority. In his mind, twisted by privilege and prejudice, she was contaminating his son with poor people food, marking him as less than elite. The sweet potato, orange and common, became a symbol of everything Marcus feared. Ordinariness, poverty, blackness creeping into his perfectly white world. That Dolores had made this decision without consulting him, had taken initiative based on her observations of William's needs, challenged his authority in a way that his fragile ego couldn't tolerate. "This is what you feed your own children, isn't it?" He'd sneered as the sweet potato dripped down the Italian marble wall, leaving an orange stain that looked like modern art. "This garbage? This is why your people never get ahead. You don't even know what quality looks like." The words had come out in a torrent of rage that surprised even him, years of carefully hidden prejudice erupting like pus from an infected wound. 3 years of college, and you're still just a he'd stopped himself, some small part of his brain recognizing that finishing that sentence would cross a line even he couldn't come back from. Dolores had wanted to respond that she didn't have children, that she'd sacrificed that possibility to save her mother, that she had 7 years of college actually, that the garbage he was describing was precisely calibrated nutrition designed to keep his son's heart stable. She wanted to tell him that her people included doctors and lawyers and teachers and engineers, that the only thing keeping them from getting ahead was men like him who couldn't see past skin color to capability. But she'd learned that defending herself only made things worse. Men like Marcus didn't want explanations. They wanted submission. They wanted to feel superior, and any challenge to that superiority was met with increased cruelty. So she'd stood there, taking his abuse while William screamed, his little face turning red then purple with distress, his heart rate certainly spiking to dangerous levels. The worst part wasn't the humiliation Dolores had endured worse during hospital rotations, where attending physicians had questioned whether she'd gotten into medical school through affirmative action, where patients had requested white doctors, where she'd been mistaken for cleaning staff despite wearing a white coat with her name embroidered on it. The worst part was leaving William, knowing his heart was already stressed, knowing that without her careful monitoring he could die. As security escorted her through the marble lobby, she'd whispered urgently to James Porter, the security chief, "Please watch the baby. Make sure someone checks on him every hour, please." James had nodded, understanding in his eyes, but they both knew he had no real power to ensure William's safety, that his job was to keep people out, not protect the people inside. Patricia Coleman, the head of human resources for the building, not just the Whitfield penthouse, but the entire residential tower, had arrived within minutes. A 45-year-old white woman who'd perfected the art of corporate cruelty, wrapped in professional language. She'd found Dolores in the service hallway, where she'd been told to wait like a disciplined child. Patricia's face was a mask of professional indifference, hiding personal discomfort. She knew this was wrong, but her own job depended on keeping the building's wealthiest resident happy. "Mr. Whitfield has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately," she'd said, not bothering with condolences or context, her voice as cold as the marble floors. "Security will need to search your belongings before you leave, standard procedure for domestic staff." The search had been humiliating in its thoroughness. James Porter's hands were apologetic as he went through her purse, finding medical journals she studied during William's naps, the New England Journal of Medicine, Pediatric Cardiology Review, papers on infant arrhythmias. She'd been reading to better understand William's condition. He'd found the stethoscope she used to monitor William's heart, a professional-grade instrument that cost more than Marcus paid her in a week. He'd found the notebook where she tracked William's symptoms in medical terminology. Marcus wouldn't have understood prolonged QT intervals observed during feeding, cyanosis present during emotional distress, irregular cardiac rhythm detected between 2:04 a.m. James had looked at these items with confusion but said nothing, following protocol even as his eyes asked questions. Maria Rodriguez had been mopping the lobby when Dolores was escorted out, though mopping was a generous description of what she was actually doing. Mostly she was trying to look busy while thinking about her night classes at Hunter College. 23 years old, working the morning shift to pay for school, she'd recognized the look on Dolores's face immediately. The same expression her mother wore. When rich families fired her for invented infractions, the dignity maintained despite humiliation, the tears held back through pure will. Without thinking, Maria had pulled out her phone and started recording. She'd learned from her mother's experiences that evidence mattered, that, without proof, the story would be twisted to make the victim the villain. The video captured everything in devastating clarity. Dolores's dignified walk, despite tears streaming down her face, the security guards flanking her like she was dangerous, the other residents averting their eyes in that particular way of wealthy people avoiding uncomfortable realities, and echoing from 40 floors above, the sound of William's desperate crying. The baby's wails seemed to follow Dolores through the lobby, down the elevator, onto the street, as if his tiny body knew she was leaving and was protesting with every ounce of strength he had. Maria had kept recording, even as Patricia Coleman approached her, even as her supervisor warned her with his eyes to stop. She'd learned that sometimes bearing witness was the only power the powerless had, and she would bear witness to this injustice, even if it cost her job. In the IT department 3 floors down, Kevin Chen monitored the building's security feeds as part of his daily routine, one screen among dozens, showing the controlled chaos of wealth in motion. He watched the scene unfold in real time, his stomach turning as he recognized what was happening. Kevin had been with the company for 5 years, one of the few Asian employees to reach management level. Though he knew his position was precarious, dependent on being useful but not threatening, smart but not too smart, visible but not too visible. He'd learned to stay quiet about the racism he witnessed, telling himself it wasn't his battle, that Asian Americans had their own struggles without taking on others. But something about seeing Dolores, who always smiled and asked about his daughter, who remembered that his wife was pregnant and asked about her health, being humiliated this way moved him to action. He quickly copied the security footage to an encrypted drive before it could be deleted, knowing that the building's policy was to erase recordings after 24 hours unless there was an incident. This would certainly be classified as an incident, but not the kind that management would want preserved. He captured multiple angles: the kitchen confrontation, the walk through the lobby, the escort out of the building. He even found footage from the previous weeks, showing Dolores's dedication, arriving early, staying late, singing to William during his crying fits, checking on him multiple times during the night, through the baby monitor app on her phone. The contrast between her care and Marcus's indifference was stark and undeniable. 20 minutes after Dolores left, William's condition became genuinely alarming. The infant had been crying so hard he'd vomited, his tiny body convulsing with sobs that seemed too powerful for his small frame. He refused the bottle from the emergency nanny Marcus had called from the most expensive agency in Manhattan, turning his head away and wailing louder when she tried to hold him. His temperature spiked to 103 degrees, high enough to cause seizures in an infant. His skin had developed a mottled appearance, patches of red and white that indicated circulatory distress. The emergency nanny, despite 30 years of experience with difficult babies, lasted exactly 12 minutes before declaring, "There's something seriously wrong with this baby. He needs a doctor, not a nanny." Dr. Morrison, the concierge pediatrician who charged $2,000 for house calls and specialized in telling wealthy parents what they wanted to hear, arrived to find a baby in genuine medical distress. William's heart rate was 200 beats per minute, dangerously high for an infant at rest. His breathing was labored, each breath seeming to require enormous effort. His fontanelle, the soft spot on his skull, was sunken, indicating dehydration despite Marcus's insistence that he'd just eaten. Morrison's examination revealed what Dolores had been managing for months: prolonged QT intervals on the portable EKG, irregular heart rhythms that could lead to sudden death, signs of a serious cardiac condition that required immediate specialized care. "This baby needs to be in the ER immediately," Morrison said, already reaching for his phone to call an ambulance. "He's showing signs of cardiac distress that could be fatal if not treated immediately." But Marcus refused, terrified of the publicity that would come from his son being hospitalized on the same day he'd fired the nanny. The story was already spreading on social media. Adding a medical emergency would make it impossible to control the narrative. "Treat him here," he demanded, pulling out his phone to transfer money to Morrison's account. "I'll pay whatever it takes. 100,000, 200,000. Just fix him here." Morrison wanted to argue but knew it was futile. He'd seen wealthy parents choose image over health before. though rarely this blatantly, rarely with stakes this high. He thought of his own medical school loans, his own children's college funds, and made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. He set up monitoring equipment in the nursery, converting the designer space into a makeshift ICU. He administered infant acetaminophen for the fever, though he knew it wouldn't address the underlying cardiac issues. He tried to get William to take formula, but the baby continued to refuse, his body seeming to shut down in protest of Dolores's absence. Meanwhile, Maria's video had exploded on social media with the kind of velocity that only injustice could generate. She'd posted it on TikTok with a caption that read, "Billionaire fired his nanny for feeding his baby, while the baby is literally dying without her. You can hear him crying. This is evil. Number, Justice for Dolores. Number, Save Baby William." The video went viral immediately, the algorithm recognizing and boosting content that combined wealth, racism, and child endangerment, the holy trinity of social media engagement. Within an hour, it had 1 million views. Within 3 hours, 5 million. The comments section became a battlefield of experiences, with thousands of domestic workers sharing similar stories of being fired for arbitrary reasons, of caring for children who loved them, only to be torn away when parents felt threatened by the bond. Black women in particular shared stories of being called mammies by the same families who entrusted them with their children's lives, of being treated as both essential and disposable, trusted and suspected, needed and resented. Black Twitter mobilized with its characteristic efficiency and thoroughness. Within hours, they'd identified Marcus Whitfield, pulled up Whitfield Technologies' corporate filings, found the diversity statistics that revealed not a single black executive in leadership positions, despite claims of commitment to inclusion. They discovered the lawsuits settled quietly with NDAs, the former employees paid to keep quiet about discrimination. They found Dolores's LinkedIn profile, her Columbia Medical School graduation announcement, her deferred residency at Mount Sinai. The narrative transformed from a simple, wrongful termination to something more sinister. A brilliant young black woman forced into domestic service by circumstance, fired for feeding a baby by a man who didn't know she was more qualified to care for his son than any pediatrician he'd hired. The hashtag number Dr. Dolores began trending alongside number Justice for Dolores and number Save Baby William. People began sharing their own stories of hidden brilliance, the surgeon driving Uber, the engineer cleaning offices, the professor working as a cashier. The conversation expanded beyond one incident to encompass the waste of human potential that systemic racism created. The brilliant minds lost to prejudice and circumstance. Someone found Dolores's published papers from medical school, her research on infant cardiac conditions that had won national awards. The contrast between her qualifications and her treatment became impossible to ignore. The mainstream media picked up the story by evening, unable to ignore something that had captured public attention so completely. CNN led with Tech Billionaire Fires Nanny as infant son falls ill, with a panel discussing the vulnerability of domestic workers. The New York Times began investigating not just the firing but Whitfield Technologies' entire corporate culture, finding a pattern of discrimination that went back years. MSNBC assembled experts to discuss the particular vulnerability of black women in domestic service, the historical echoes of slavery that made such positions particularly fraught. Even Fox News, typically sympathetic to billionaires and dismissive of cancel culture, couldn't spin the story positively when reports emerged that Marcus was refusing to hospitalize his increasingly sick infant. Dolores sat in her mother's hospital room at Memorial Sloan Kettering, watching the story explode on the small television mounted to the wall. Patricia was sleeping fitfully, the chemotherapy drugs making her alternate between deep unconsciousness and agitated waking. When she woke, she immediately sensed her daughter's distress. "What happened, baby?" she asked, her voice hoarse from treatment, but still carrying the authority of a mother who knew when her child was hurting. Dolores told her everything: the confrontation, the humiliation, the firing. But most importantly, her fears for William. He has long QT syndrome. Mama, type 2. Probably inherited from his father's side. Without proper management, she couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say that William could die. Probably would die, without her careful monitoring. I've been managing it for months, adjusting his feeding schedule, monitoring his heart rate, preventing triggers. Without me, tears flowed freely now that she was away from public eyes, the professional composure she'd maintained crumbling in the safety of her mother's presence. Then you have to act, Patricia said with more strength than she'd shown in weeks. I didn't sacrifice everything for you to become a doctor just to watch you hide it. That baby needs you. His mother would want you to save him. Patricia struggled to sit up, her thin arms shaking with effort. You remember what I always told you? That we have to be twice as good to get half as much? Well, baby, you're 10 times as good as anyone in that building. Time to make them see it. It was true, Catherine had somehow known, had sensed that Dolores was more than she appeared. In their few months together, before the embolism took her, Catherine had asked probing questions about child development that went beyond normal parental curiosity. She'd noticed when Dolores used medical terminology, had seen her reading medical journals during William's naps, had once caught her using a stethoscope to check William's heart. You're not just a nanny, are you? Catherine had asked 2 weeks before she died, her eyes knowing. Dolores had deflected, but Catherine had smiled sadly. Whatever you are, I'm glad you're here. I feel like William is safe with you. Promise me, if anything happens to me, you'll keep him safe. That evening, Dolores received a call that changed everything. The number was blocked, but the voice was familiar. Dr. Sarah Kim, her attending physician during her pediatric rotation at Mount Sinai. Dolores, I saw the news. But more importantly, I pulled some records. You did a newborn assessment on William Whitfield during your rotation last year, when he was brought in for a wellness check. You documented concerns about possible long QT syndrome in your notes. You recommended genetic testing that was never done. Do you understand what this means? Dolores's hands shook as she absorbed the implications. There was official medical documentation that she'd identified William's condition months ago, that she'd tried to ensure proper testing, that the system had ignored her concerns because she was just a medical student, and the Whitfields had the best pediatricians in Manhattan. The records showed that she'd specifically noted the prolonged QT intervals, had recommended immediate genetic testing, had even written that failure to address this condition could result in sudden infant death syndrome. But her recommendations had been dismissed, overruled by Dr. Harassing, the pediatrician Marcus had chosen because he had offices in the right zip codes and charged the right prices. Jerome Washington, Dolores's older brother, and a civil rights attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, saw the opportunity immediately when she called him. Jerome had spent 10 years fighting cases everyone said were unwinnable, taking on corporations and government agencies that seemed untouchable. He'd learned that sometimes the perfect case came disguised as personal tragedy. This isn't just wrongful termination, he said, pacing his Brooklyn apartment as he spoke, his mind already constructing legal strategies. This is criminal negligence, child endangerment, and potentially manslaughter if that baby dies. We're going to expose all of it, the racism, the classism, the fact that a qualified doctor was treated as less than human while a baby's life hung in the balance. He began assembling a legal team that night. The legendary attorney, who'd taken down 3 Fortune 500 companies for discrimination and won the largest civil rights settlement in U.S. history. Michelle listened to the story, reviewed the evidence, and agreed to take the case pro bono. This is bigger than one family, she said. This is about every brilliant black person forced to hide their light, every immigrant doctor driving taxis, every woman whose expertise is dismissed because of how she looks. We're going to make them see. The next morning, while William's condition continued to deteriorate and Marcus continued to refuse hospitalization, Jerome called a press conference on the steps of Mount Sinai Hospital. The location was deliberately chosen, the very hospital where Dolores should have been completing her residency, where she'd identified William's condition, where she would have been saving lives openly instead of in secret. Dolores stood beside him wearing her white coat from Columbia, her medical school honors cords draped over her shoulders, her Phi Beta Kappa key visible. She looked every inch the doctor she was, her beauty and intelligence undeniable even to those who dismissed her as just the nanny. The crowd of reporters and supporters fell silent as she approached the microphones. Behind her stood her medical school classmates, professors, and attending physicians who'd come to support her. Dr. Martinez, her mentor, stood with tears in his eyes, finally understanding why his best student had disappeared. The visual was powerful. A young black woman, backed by the medical establishment she should have been part of, confronting the prejudice that had forced her into hiding. "My name is Dr. Dolores Washington," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "I graduated from Columbia Medical School 6 months ago, first in my class, with a specialty in pediatric cardiology. I deferred my residency to care for my mother who was dying of cancer, taking a position as a nanny to pay for her treatment. But I never stopped being a doctor. 3 weeks ago, I saved William Whitfield's life when he stopped breathing in his crib. His heart had stopped due to an undiagnosed condition I'd been managing for months. I performed infant CPR for 2 minutes before he came back, alone in a nursery while his father slept down the hall." She held up a folder of medical records, her hands steady. "I documented my concerns about William's condition during his newborn assessment at this very hospital. I identified long QT syndrome and recommended immediate genetic testing. My recommendations were ignored because I was just a medical student and Mr. Whitfield had chosen a pediatrician who charges $5,000 per visit but missed what I saw immediately. For 6 months, I've been practicing medicine without recognition, without respect, but with complete dedication to a baby who needed me." The crowd was silent, absorbing the magnitude of what they were hearing. Dolores continued, her voice growing stronger. "The sweet potato puree that Mr. Whitfield called slave food was specifically chosen for its potassium content to help regulate William's heart rhythm. Every feeding was timed to prevent reflux that could trigger arrhythmias. Every nap was monitored to ensure his breathing remained stable. Every bath was temperature-controlled to prevent the thermal shock that could stop his heart. I wasn't just a nanny. I was keeping that baby alive every single day. And his father never knew, because he couldn't see past my skin color to my credentials." Jerome took the microphone next, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years fighting systems of oppression. "We're filing emergency petitions with family court for immediate intervention. We're also filing criminal charges against Marcus Whitfield for child endangerment. The evidence is clear he's refused medical treatment for a critically ill infant because he's more concerned about his image than his son's life. We're also suing Whitfield Technologies for creating a culture of discrimination that extends from corporate boardrooms to private homes. This ends now." As if orchestrated by fate, Dr. Morrison called during the press conference. Jerome put him on speaker, with Morrison's permission, letting the crowd hear the panic in his voice. "The Whitfield baby is in critical condition. His heart rate is extremely irregular, and he's showing signs of impending cardiac arrest. I've called 911 against Mr. Whitfield's wishes. We need someone who understands his specific presentation immediately. Is Dr. Washington available?" Without hesitation, Dolores ran to the waiting car, her white coat billowing behind her like a cape. The image, a young black woman racing to save the baby of the man who'd humiliated her, became the defining moment of the entire saga. News helicopters followed her car through Manhattan traffic, broadcasting live as she ran into Mount Sinai's emergency room, where paramedics were just arriving with William. The scene in the ER was controlled chaos. William was so small on the adult-sized gurney, his tiny body barely visible among the equipment keeping him alive. His skin had a grayish tinge that made experienced nurses exchange worried looks. Marcus followed, shouting about privacy violations and lawsuits, but the medical staff ignored him. The attending pediatric cardiologist, Dr. Jennifer Hayes, took one look at the EKG readings and went pale. "This is severe long QT syndrome. How the hell was this missed? Get me a full genetic panel. Start him on propranolol." And she was interrupted by Dolores's arrival, still in her white coat, her medical credentials visible to all. Without waiting for permission or introduction, Dolores moved to William's bedside, her trained eyes taking in everything at once. "Type 2 long QT," she said without preamble, her hands already moving to adjust William's position, triggered by emotional stress and hypoglycemia. He needs 0.5 milligram per kilogram of propranolol, but start at half dose. He's sensitive. Keep his glucose above 80, temperature between 97 and 99 degrees. He responds best to vertical holding with slight pressure on his left side. She looked at the nurse preparing the IV. Use a 24-gauge needle, not 22, his veins are fragile. And he needs the blue blanket from his crib. Sensory familiarity will help stabilize his heart rate. Dr. Hayes stared at her, recognizing expertise when she heard it. You're the nanny? She asked incredulously. I'm Dr. Washington, Dolores replied, already adjusting William's position. I've been managing his condition for 6 months. I need his current electrolyte panel, and someone needs to get his comfort items from the penthouse immediately. His heart rate responds to familiar stimuli. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, watching the woman he'd called people demonstrate medical expertise that surpassed doctors twice her age. She worked with precision and confidence, her hands gentle but sure as she adjusted IV lines, calculated medication dosages, and most importantly, soothed William with a familiar voice and touch. She began humming the gospel hymn she always used to calm him. Wade in the water, her voice steady and soothing. The effect was immediate and seemed miraculous to those watching. William's heart rate, which had been dangerously erratic, began to stabilize. His breathing became less labored. The blue tinge around his lips faded to healthy pink. Impossible, Dr. Hayes muttered, watching the monitors normalize. That should have taken hours, not minutes. He knows me, Dolores said simply, her hand stroking William's head as she continued humming. Medicine isn't just about drugs and procedures. It's about connection, trust, and understanding each patient's individual needs. William needs familiarity, consistency, and someone who sees him as more than a medical case or a billionaire's heir. He needs someone who loves him. She looked at Marcus then, not with anger but with pity. He needs what money can't buy: genuine care from someone who values his life over their paycheck. The next 48 hours were critical. Dolores never left William's side, working with the medical team to stabilize his condition while teaching them his specific triggers and responses. She explained how certain sounds could trigger arrhythmias, how he needed to be held at a specific angle during feeding, how his heart rate responded to different voices and songs. The medical staff watched in awe as she demonstrated a level of patient-specific knowledge that typically took years to develop. She'd created protocols based on 6 months of careful observation, had developed techniques that weren't in any textbook but worked perfectly for William. The story dominated national news. Every major network carried live updates about the baby saved by the nanny who was actually a doctor. The Columbia Medical School dean, Dr. Robert Chen, gave interviews praising Dolores as one of the most brilliant students they'd ever had. Her thesis on detecting cardiac abnormalities in infants was groundbreaking, he said on CNN. We offered her positions usually reserved for doctors with years of experience. The fact that she was working as a nanny while possessing this level of expertise is an indictment of our entire system. The Mount Sinai residency director, Dr. Abraham Goldstein, publicly stated her position would be waiting whenever she was ready. We don't just want Dr. Washington in our program, he said at a press conference. We need her. Her approach to medicine, seeing the whole patient, not just the disease, is what we should all aspire to. He announced that Mount Sinai was creating a new program to identify and support medical professionals who'd been forced out of the field by systemic barriers, calling it the Dolores Washington Initiative. GoFundMe pages for Patricia Washington's cancer treatment raised $3 million in 2 days. Donations came from everywhere, other domestic workers giving $5, tech workers giving thousands, and surprisingly, several anonymous donations of $100, 000 each, that were traced back to employees at Whitfield Technologies who'd witnessed discrimination but been too afraid to speak up. The money would not only cover Patricia's treatment but establish a fund for other domestic workers facing medical crises. The legal ramifications were swift and severe. The Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, announced criminal charges against Marcus for child endangerment and neglect. Mr. Whitfield's actions went beyond bad judgment, he said at a press conference. He knowingly refused medical treatment for a critically ill infant because he was more concerned about his public image than his son's life. That's criminal. The Department of Children and Families opened an investigation into his fitness as a parent, with the preliminary report suggesting immediate removal of custody. Whitfield Technologies' board of directors held an emergency meeting via video conference, as several members refused to be in the same room as Marcus. The vote was unanimous. Marcus was removed as CEO effective immediately, with Bradley Stone, the CFO, taking over as interim leader. The stock price plummeted 40% in after-hours trading as investors fled, understanding that the company's discrimination went beyond bad optics to potential criminal liability. Multiple employees came forward with their own stories of discrimination, creating a cascade of lawsuits that would ultimately cost the company billions. On the third day, as William's condition stabilized, Elizabeth Thornton arrived from Boston. Catherine's mother was a federal judge's widow who understood both power and justice intimately. She'd been traveling in Europe when her daughter died, returning to find her grandson in the care of a nanny she'd never met. She'd watched the news coverage with growing horror and recognition, remembering conversations with Catherine before her death. Catherine had been worried about William, had sensed something was wrong that the doctors were missing, had talked about finding special help for him. She entered the hospital room where Dolores sat holding William, singing softly, the baby finally peaceful after days of crisis. "You're the one Catherine chose, aren't you?" Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. She knew something was wrong with William's heart. She knew Marcus wouldn't listen. "She found you specifically, didn't she?" Dolores nodded, remembering the strange interview where Catherine had asked more about her medical knowledge than her childcare experience. "She found my medical school graduation announcement online," Dolores explained. "She reached out through the agency but requested me specifically. She offered triple the normal salary if I would provide what she called medical oversight for William. She made me promise to protect him, even from his father if necessary. She said, 'I won't be here long, I can feel it. But you'll be here for William, won't you?' I thought she was being dramatic, but she knew. Somehow, she knew." Elizabeth pulled out her phone, showing a text conversation with Catherine from 2 weeks before her death. "I found a doctor to be W's nanny. M doesn't know he'd fire her immediately if he knew she was smarter than his precious Dr. Harrison. She's brilliant, Mom. A young black woman who graduated top of her class from Columbia. If anything happens to me, she'll keep William safe. I've put money aside in a separate account to keep paying her if M tries to fire her. The account information is in my jewelry box, in the false bottom I showed you. Promise me. You'll make sure she stays with William." The revelation that Catherine had specifically hired Dolores for her medical expertise, that she'd known her son needed protection his father couldn't provide, transformed the narrative again. Elizabeth immediately filed for emergency custody, arguing that Marcus had fired the very person his late wife had chosen to protect their son. "My daughter knew her husband's nature," Elizabeth told the court. "She knew his prejudices would blind him to what William needed, so she found a guardian angel and disguised her as domestic help. That Marcus fired this angel proves he's unfit to raise my grandson." Marcus's breakdown came that evening. He'd been barred from William's room. After causing distress that triggered arrhythmias, his very presence had become dangerous to his son. Standing in the hallway, watching through glass as Dolores expertly managed William's care, something finally cracked in his carefully constructed worldview. His whole life had been built on the premise that he was superior, smarter, better, more deserving of success. Now he was watching a woman he'd dismissed as worthless demonstrate expertise he couldn't even comprehend. When Dolores emerged for a break, he approached her, his usual arrogance replaced by something raw and desperate. "I could have killed him," he said, his voice breaking. "My son could have died because I couldn't see past. Because I thought." He couldn't finish, couldn't articulate the prejudice that had nearly cost his son's life. The words stuck in his throat like physical objects, choking him with their ugliness. "Yes," Dolores said simply, not softening the truth. "Your racism almost killed your son. Your need to feel superior to me mattered more than William's life. You saw my skin color and assumed I was worthless, that my care was contamination rather than salvation. You're not sorry for how you treated me. You're sorry that there were consequences. You're sorry that the world saw who you really are." She started to walk away, then turned back. "I'll continue to care for William because I love him and because I'm a doctor who took an oath. But I'll never forgive you. Some things are unforgivable. Every time you see your son alive and healthy, remember that he's that way despite you, not because of you." The legal proceedings moved with unprecedented speed. Marcus was stripped of custody within a week. With Elizabeth Thornton appointed as primary guardian, he was allowed supervised visitation only, required to undergo extensive therapy and anti-racism education before any unsupervised contact. The therapy sessions would become infamous when the therapist later wrote a book about treating narcissistic personality disorder, using Marcus as a case study of how privilege and prejudice could become pathological. Whitfield Technologies settled the discrimination lawsuit for $50 million, with $30 million going to establish the Dolores Washington Foundation for domestic workers pursuing higher education. The settlement included provisions for reforming the company's entire culture, with mandatory anti-racism training, diverse hiring quotas, and regular audits by external organizations. Marcus's personal assets were frozen pending criminal trial. His penthouse sold to pay legal fees and settlements. The man who'd built an empire on believing he was superior to others found himself with nothing but the knowledge that his prejudice had nearly killed his only child. But the real transformation was happening beyond the courtroom. Dolores's story had triggered a national reckoning about hidden talent and wasted potential. Universities began creating programs to identify and support brilliant people working in service positions. Hospitals started recognizing foreign medical degrees more readily. The phrase, "just the nanny" or "just the housekeeper," became recognized as slurs. Acknowledgments that domestic work was real work deserving of dignity and respect. 6 months after the incident, Dolores began her residency at Mount Sinai while continuing to care for William part-time. The arrangement was unprecedented but necessary. She was the only person who fully understood his condition, and his attachment to her was crucial for his emotional and physical health. She would spend mornings in the hospital, afternoons with William, and evenings with her mother, who was responding well to treatment thanks to the GoFundMe. It was exhausting but fulfilling. The life she'd imagined as a doctor expanded to include a child she loved as her own. The media attention eventually died down, but the impact continued rippling outward. States began passing legislation protecting domestic workers from arbitrary termination and ensuring basic rights like sick leave and health care. The Dolores Washington Act became federal law, providing whistleblower protection for domestic workers who reported abuse or dangerous conditions. Medical schools created bridge programs for immigrant doctors and those who'd left the profession due to family obligations. The hidden physicians of America began emerging from the shadows. A year after the incident, William celebrated his first birthday not in a cold Manhattan penthouse but in Elizabeth Thornton's warm Boston townhouse. The party was small but significant. Dolores was there, of course, as was her mother Patricia, now in remission, thanks to the treatment the GoFundMe had provided. Jerome came with his family, as did Maria Rodriguez, now a journalism student at Columbia funded by the settlement. James Porter attended, having left Whitfield Technologies to start his own security company, focused on protecting vulnerable workers. Even some of Dolores's medical school classmates came, having followed her story with awe and admiration. Marcus was allowed to attend for 1 hour, supervised by a social worker. He sat quietly in a corner, watching his son play with children of all colors, listening to languages he'd once forbidden in his presence. Seeing the joy on William's face when Dolores entered the room. The baby who'd barely recognized him now called Dolores Mama D and reached for her constantly. When it was time to leave, Marcus approached Dolores with a small gift, a photo album he'd compiled of William's first year, including pictures he'd taken secretly of her caring for his son. "I saw it," he said quietly, his voice different from the commanding tone he'd once used, even when I pretended not to. "How he lit up when you held him. How you checked his breathing when you thought no one was watching. How you loved him when I couldn't. I'm sorry for what I took from you. Your dignity. Your respect. Your truth. I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have." The album contained not just photos but notes he'd written, documenting all the times he'd noticed her expertise but refused to acknowledge it. All the moments his prejudice had blinded him to the angel in his home. Dolores looked at the album, seeing herself through Marcus's eyes, not as the help but as the guardian she'd always been. There were photos of her reading medical journals during William's naps, checking his pulse while pretending to play, adjusting his feeding position to prevent reflux. Marcus had seen it all and chosen to ignore it, chosen his prejudice over his son's well-being. "Sorry isn't enough," she agreed. "But change might be. Use your remaining influence to help other domestic workers. Fund scholarships for Black medical students. Teach other men like you that superiority is an illusion, that the people serving you might be saving you. She handed the album back. Give this to William when he's older. Let him know that love comes in many colors, that help comes from unexpected places, that the people society dismisses might be the ones heaven sends. Let him know that his mother saw clearly even when his father couldn't, that she protected him even from beyond the grave by sending me. 2 years later, Dr. Dolores Washington stood at a podium, accepting the American Medical Association's Award for Excellence in Pediatric Care. She'd completed her residency with honors, while pioneering new protocols for managing long QT syndrome in infants. Her research, based partly on her detailed notes from William's care, had been published in leading medical journals and was now standard practice in NICUs across the country. She'd become known not just for her medical expertise, but for her insistence on treating every caregiver, parent, nanny, or otherwise as part of the medical team. In her acceptance speech, she spoke about the night she'd saved William as an infant, performing CPR in a nursery decorated like a museum, while a billionaire slept down the hall, unaware his son was dying. "I could have let him die," she said, the audience gasping at her honesty. "I could have let racism claim another victim, let prejudice become a death sentence, but I chose love over hate, chose life over vengeance. That choice didn't make me noble. It made me human. The real tragedy isn't what happened to me. It's how many other Dr. Washingtons are out there right now, their brilliance hidden behind mops and vacuum cleaners, their expertise dismissed because of their skin color or accent, their contributions erased because society can't see past its prejudices." She looked at the audience, seeing faces of all colors, including Marcus Whitfield in the back row, and continued, "Every domestic worker you've dismissed as just the help might be a doctor, an engineer, a teacher, a genius. Every person serving you coffee might speak 3 languages and hold 2 degrees. Every nanny raising your children might be more qualified than you to make decisions about their health and welfare. The revolution isn't in making these people visible, they've always been visible to those willing to see. The revolution is in removing the blindness that privilege creates, the assumption that service means servitude, that helping means inferior." William, now 2.5 years old, was in the audience with Elizabeth Thornton. He was thriving, his heart condition perfectly managed, his development on track, bilingual in English and Spanish thanks to Dolores's teaching. When he saw Auntie D on stage, he called out, "That's my doctor," in the clear voice of a child who'd learned to speak surrounded by love in multiple languages. The audience laughed, but Dolores's eyes filled with tears. He would grow up knowing that the woman who'd saved his life had been dismissed as worthless by his father. But he would also know that worth wasn't determined by others' perceptions but by one's actions. The transformation of Whitfield Technologies became a Harvard Business School case study in crisis management and genuine change. Under new leadership, the company had instituted radical reforms that went beyond cosmetic diversity initiatives. 50% of leadership positions were now held by people of color. The building's service entrances had been permanently sealed, with all employees using the same entrances regardless of position. The executive floors had been converted into childcare centers, where all employees' children were cared for together, breaking down the barriers between service and leadership. The company's stock had recovered and exceeded its previous value, proving that diversity wasn't just morally right but financially beneficial. Marcus Whitfield, stripped of his fortune and status, worked as a diversity consultant, though his past made him a controversial figure. He spoke at conferences about unconscious bias, using his story as a cautionary tale, though many questioned whether he was profiting from his redemption narrative or genuinely trying to change. "I nearly killed my son because I couldn't see the humanity in someone I deemed inferior," he would say. "I had a doctor in my home and called her the help. I had a guardian angel and called her you people. My prejudice cost me everything. My company, my wealth, my son, but it almost cost my son his life. That's the price of racism. It destroys the racist, but kills the innocent." 5 years after that terrible morning, William started kindergarten at a diverse public school in Boston, his choice among many elite private schools that would have welcomed him. On his first day, when asked what his parents did, he said proudly, "My grandmother is a judge, and my Auntie D is a doctor who saves babies." When another child said, "She's not your real aunt," William replied with the wisdom of a child raised right. Real family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them. Auntie D showed up when I was dying. That makes her more real than anything. Dolores's mother, Patricia, lived another 3 years. Long enough to see her daughter graduate from residency, establish a thriving practice, and win national recognition. On her deathbed, she held Dolores's hand and said, "I'm proud of you, baby. Not just for becoming a doctor, but for staying one, even when they tried to make you small. You fed that baby sweet potatoes and saved his life. You showed the world that we've always been doctors, teachers, engineers, just hidden behind uniforms and prejudice. You made them see us." The funeral was attended by hundreds of medical colleagues, former classmates, families Dolores had helped, and surprisingly, Marcus Whitfield. He stood in the back, understanding he wasn't welcome, but needing to pay respects to the woman whose illness had inadvertently saved his son's life. After the service, he approached Dolores for what would be the last time. "Your mother raised a remarkable woman," he said simply. "I'm sorry I couldn't see it until it was too late." Dolores looked at him, seeing not the billionaire who'd humiliated her, but a broken man trying to rebuild himself. "She raised me to save lives," she replied. "Even the lives of people who hate us. That's not weakness, that's strength. You took everything from me except that strength. And with that strength, I saved your son." 10 years after the incident, Dr. Dolores Washington became the youngest chief of pediatric cardiology in Mount Sinai's history. Her office walls were covered with photos of children she'd saved, many of them from poor families who couldn't afford specialists. She'd established free clinics in underserved communities, created training programs for domestic workers to recognize medical symptoms in the children they cared for, and never forgot that she'd once been dismissed as just the nanny. Her research had saved thousands of lives, but she always said her greatest save was William, not just because she'd kept him alive, but because his story had exposed the lie that some people were born to serve and others to be served. William grew up to become a pediatric cardiologist himself, inspired by the woman who'd saved his life. He specialized in treating children from poor families, understanding that every child deserved the same care, whether their parents were billionaires or bus drivers. In medical school, when professors asked why he'd chosen medicine, he'd tell them about the sweet potato puree, about the nanny who was really a doctor, about the father whose racism nearly killed him. "I'm alive because a black woman loved me more than my white father did," he would say. "I'm alive because someone saw my humanity when my own parent saw her as subhuman. That's why I'm a doctor, to see everyone clearly. To never mistake service for servitude. To remember that angels often come disguised as the help." At 30, William married Keisha Jordan Jr., the daughter of Whitfield Technology's chief diversity officer, a brilliant black doctor he'd met during residency. Their wedding was held in the former Whitfield penthouse, now a community center serving domestic workers and their families. Dolores officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. In her remarks, she said, "Love is not blind, it sees clearly. It sees past color to character, past position to personhood, past prejudice to truth." William and Keisha see each other clearly, as equals, as partners, as humans. That's all any of us want, to be seen clearly, to be valued truly, to be loved wholly. Marcus, not invited but watching from across the street, saw his son marry a black woman in the space where he'd once humiliated one. The irony was complete. The revolution accomplished. His grandson would be mixed race, would carry both the privilege of the Whitfield name and the strength of the Jordan legacy, would grow up in a world where his grandfather's prejudices seemed not just wrong but incomprehensible. That child would never understand how someone could look at another human and see only their skin color, would never comprehend how service could be mistaken for servitude, would take for granted that brilliance came in all shades. The true revolution wasn't in the laws passed or the companies reformed or even the lives saved. It was in consciousness shifted, in assumptions shattered, in the recognition that every person serving coffee, cleaning offices, or caring for children might be carrying brilliance that circumstances had forced to hide. Every time someone looked at domestic workers and wondered what dreams they'd deferred, every time a parent recognized expertise in their child's caregiver, every time a CEO remembered that wealth didn't equal worth, the revolution continued. 25 years after that morning when sweet potato puree hit a marble wall, Dr. William Whitfield Jordan published a memoir titled Slave Food Saved My Life, a story of hidden angels. In it, he wrote about growing up, knowing that the woman who'd raised him had been humiliated by his father, about learning that love could transcend hate, about understanding that the people society dismissed were often the ones heaven sent to save us. The book became required reading in medical schools, a reminder that healing was about more than medicine, that seeing clearly was the first step to treating effectively. The dedication read, "To Dr. Dolores Washington, who was never just the nanny, but always my guardian angel. To my father, Marcus Whitfield, who learned too late that angels come in colors he'd been taught not to see. And to my mother, Catherine, who saw clearly enough to hide an angel in plain sight. May we all learn to see each other clearly, value each other truly, and love each other wholly." The final image anyone remembers is from Dolores's retirement party at Mount Sinai, where she'd served as chief of pediatric cardiology for 15 years. The room was filled with hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, babies she'd saved, now grown with babies of their own, students she'd mentored now leading departments, domestic workers she'd helped become doctors, nurses, teachers. William gave the toast, his own children playing at his feet, twin boys named after Dolores's father and Catherine, carrying forward the legacy of those who'd sacrificed for others. "Dr. Washington saved my life 3 times, William said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent his life in medicine. "Once, when I stopped breathing as an infant. Once when she managed my heart condition despite being called the help. And once when she showed me that human worth isn't determined by wealth or color, but by how we treat each other when no one's watching. She taught me that medicine isn't just about healing bodies, but healing society. She showed me that revolution sometimes looks like sweet potato puree, that dignity can't be taken, only surrendered, that love transcends every barrier humans create." As applause filled the room, Dolores thought about her mother, who died believing her daughter would change the world. She thought about Catherine, who'd trusted her with her most precious possession. She thought about William, the baby whose near death had sparked a revolution. And she thought about Marcus, the man whose prejudice had paradoxically created the conditions for change. History was complex, justice imperfect, but progress possible when people refused to accept limitations others placed on them. The revolution that began in a Manhattan kitchen had become something unstoppable. The recognition that human dignity and brilliance existed everywhere, waiting only for the chance to be seen. Every domestic worker who went to night school, every immigrant doctor who fought for recognition, every child who grew up knowing that angels came in all colors, carried the revolution forward. Dolores Washington had entered Marcus Whitfield's home as a nanny and left as a doctor. But she'd always been both. The only thing that changed was the world's ability to see her clearly.